Okay, hi everybody. In today's interview, we've got an excellent speaker. So Dr. Kay Lynn Stevens, who is a professor of psychology at Columbia Basin College in the United States. Kay Lynn, thank you for joining us and giving up your time to speak to us today. If I could start by just asking you to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background into your experience, education, previous roles and stuff, so we can find out a bit more about who you are.
You bet. Well, thanks for having me today. This is really a fun opportunity. So I am, as you said, I'm a professor of psychology at Columbia Basin College, which in the US system, this particular college, we primarily focus on the first 2 years of an undergraduate education. We do have some limited bachelor's, or 4-year degree programs, but the community college system, we're connected to the 4-year institution. So we help students really get a strong opportunity to be ready to transfer and jump right into their major, which is a little different organization, than the UK system. So I've made my home at the community college kind of system. I didn't even think that it wasn't even on my radar map when I first started thinking about going to school. So I actually started my PhD in clinical psych, and I was doing neuropsychology, which I find really interesting. My research was in depression and multiple sclerosis and the connection there. So I really loved that. But what I really didn't love was the clinical work. I discovered that just really wasn't a good fit for me. So I took a year off after I finished my master's degree, and I took a job as a replacement for a person on sabbatical for 1 year at a community college. And I just really kind of fell in love with the mission there. We have more older returning students. We have more folks that are coming with English not as their first language. And we don't have a competitive application process to get in, although we get, incredible students. And so it's really been a privilege actually to make my career kind of working at this level. The thing that's happened with my research interest over time is, so I guess, let me just say, so I finished with my master's, and then I taught and did research with undergrads for over 20 years before I finally got around to going back to school and finishing my PhD. So that's always been kind of brewing in the background. And I also learned that 20 years is the limit for your credits to essentially last. So I had to start over with my coursework from before, which was a little bit of a brutal pill to swallow, but I was motivated enough that I was ready to do it. So I did. And but my research interests really started to shift a little bit in part as a result of working with the students that I worked with. So one of the courses that I teach is a human development course. And we know that adverse childhood experiences have such or the potential to create really lifelong consequences for health outcomes, mental health outcomes. And many of my students have identified that they've experienced, adverse childhood experiences, and just the effect that it has on kind of rewiring the nervous system to have a more robust stress response, to less stimulation and things like that, that I really wanted to understand a little bit more about the differences there. And so I did some research with our student population and discovered that actually having adverse childhood experiences really doesn't make a difference in terms of your ability to complete a degree. There's like no difference at all. And so I think the reality is that people that have built resilience, that they may have had bad experiences, but if they get through the door of college, they've built enough resilience that they can be successful. But that said, we live in an area where there's a pretty high rate of sex trafficking, and there's a relationship between having experienced prior trauma and being trafficked. And so once I started to become more aware of that, I wanted to be, try to be a part of the solution as much as possible. And it became clear that there really wasn't any research in the juror that I could find anyway, in the juror decision making literature, looking at sex trafficking and, how biases, extra legal factors may influence folks' decision making. And, I went in thinking that actually probably a typical victim of sex trafficking would not be viewed very charitably by the average juror, just because they, a person who's been trafficked often has, their own legal record, and, they may just not fit kind of the stereotype that we think of as somebody being nabbed off of the street against their will, to participate in something like that. And so that's really what got me interested in this. And so then I've pursued that as my line of inquiry now. And that's what leads me here today.
That's fascinating. And I really appreciate you telling us the story in terms of effectively how you got there. That's probably one of the strongest research rationales I've heard, in the sense that it's based on kind of real world observations and seeing some of these factors play out and the impacts it has on young people in particular, and saying this is clearly something that we need to investigate in more detail. So can you tell us a bit about the specific situation local to where you are then? What is it that leads, at least in your opinion, or what do we know about why that's sex trafficking is particularly prevalent and problematic there?
So part of it is interstate travel, and that we live in a transportation hub here, and not so much like air travel, but ground transportation. And so if there's sort of a kind of a pathway through this part of the United States. So I'm in the northwest part of the United States, in the state of Washington, but I'm in kind of more of the eastern part of the state. And so there's a couple of major interstate highways here, and there's quite a bit of drug traffic that comes through here. And then, we think that that's probably why that then the sex traffic bit gets going on here too. Although, that's a myth to say that it requires smuggling, but it certainly does not. But it does appear that folks that are trafficked, they do, the people that are trafficking them do tend to move them from city to city to operate for a period of time as an attempt to try to evade getting caught. Often they'll use, a person who, is referred to as a bottom. It will be someone who maybe started off as a victim, but then they get kind of groomed into being the person who's the primary contact for the other folks that are being trafficked. They use their name for making hotel reservations, et cetera. And they don't tend to stay in one spot too long, but it doesn't appear that they travel too far. So it's estimated in our area, our population is around 300,000 folks. And it's estimated that on any one night, there's between 10 and 50 folks that are being trafficked, that are being victimized. So it's a high number.
Yeah, it really is a high number. And then, in comparison to the picture more broadly throughout the US, would you say, I suppose there's quite wide variation throughout the US in terms of the prevalence of the problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I can answer it, because evidence about this is so difficult, good statistics, like how do we even know for sure? The reporting of it is limited. I will say that it's higher per capita here than in a couple of areas that aren't too far away from us, but it's because they're just not as, there isn't as interstate transportation is less accessible. So.
Okay. And so I don't know if in terms of inspiring your kind of research idea, so there's obviously a problem and there's not much research in a mock jury or a jury context that allows us to better understand how jurors would perceive those victims and survivors, I guess. Has there been like a number of high profile cases, or even any cases that's been in the press locally or across the state, where these survivors have come to trial and there's been perhaps some surprising or shocking verdicts? Do they tend to get to trial at all?
Yeah, so I think that right there is the question that's hard to answer. So in our state, and this actually varies state by state, whether it's the prosecutor or a grand jury that makes the decision about whether a case goes to trial. So in our state, it's purely the prosecutor who decides, and for better or worse. But What the evidence seems to suggest is that in a lot of situations, if they think that it's a pretty high bar to prove sex trafficking because it's defined as, force, fraud, or coercion to cause somebody to engage in a commercial sex act. Well, to prove fraud, force, or coercion is a difficult thing. And that's really where I was thinking that this is going to be a lot like what happens like with sexual assault. Like, how do you, it's a he said, she said, if you say, well, I didn't want to do it, but I did do it. How do I prove, that I was coerced? There have been some high profile cases, and I can tell you about one that I actually used some of the data from that to build the mock trial summary that I used in, my dissertation research. But there's evidence that cases they're taken to trial for lesser crimes. If they can prove something else, just that would be an easier thing to prove, they do that in order to close the case. So the highest profile case that I'm aware of in the state of Washington, and in the US, it's a federal crime, and that said, it is still prosecuted at the state level, which is, it's a whole weird kind of thing there. But it was a case in 2019. It was a guy named Aubrey Taylor who had been trafficking people, and there were 4 of his victims that were willing to come forward and testified. And each of them had kind of a different, it was like a different hook that he used to lure them in. So there was one person who was drug addicted, and so he used that. It's like, well, I'll buy you drugs to do this. There was another person who was a single mom and financially, just really in a, bad situation. And so he promised love and, money and all of that. So anyway, each person kind of had a little different story, but that case was successfully prosecuted, and Aubrey Taylor was convicted and went to prison. Now, I don't recall the sentence, exactly how long it was that he's sentenced for, but that surprised me. I just assumed that because, and I didn't actually see the people who were, serving as witnesses, because you aren't really a complainant in a sex trafficking case, you serve as a witness. And I thought that they would probably be viewed rather harshly, but the evidence apparently was strong enough that they convicted him. Now, my research is indicating that just may be the case, and I have some ideas about perhaps why that is, but I'll save that until we get to that point.
No, I think that's a really good time to start talking about your research. So the reason that obviously we're here and we're talking today is because I came across your research. I know about your research, and it's very interesting. I can make that available for people, anybody that's interested, in terms of your doctoral thesis and also the recent publication in terms of sex trafficking cases and jury decisions. So yeah, so clearly the rationale and background is evident for why this research is needed, and there's a lack of research. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about kind of what you did and what the objectives of the research were, that'd be great.
Sure. So this was really a preliminary investigation into sex trafficking within the juror/jury decision making literature. So the aim was to just see if biases perhaps do come into play. And so the specific extra legal factor that we looked at was the gender of the defendant. And the reason why we chose that, there's a number of reasons. First of all, I think especially in sexual victimization crimes, the stereotypes about who an offender is, it's typically not thought of as being, a woman, but certainly it can be. And in fact, it's estimated that anywhere from a quarter to a third of perpetrators of sex trafficking are actually women, and are perhaps more frequently family members. I mean, just saying that, it's just horrifying to imagine that, but in fact, that is the case. And so was kind of a question like, would that reality fly in the face of somebody's pre-existing ideas about who an offender might be and affect their decision making? So we developed an experimental simulation in which there were 2 conditions. All the facts of the case were the same. As I mentioned, I built it was a written mock trial summary that was based on the US v. Taylor case, and it had a complainant statement, a defendant statement, and judge's instructions to jurors. And all the facts were the same in both conditions, except for the gender of the defendant. So the complainant was female in both conditions. That's a whole other, wrinkle that, future research, and actually we're doing that examination now, what about the gender of the complainant? Because we tend to think that, a complainant is a woman in this kind of a situation that, wouldn't, that in sexual victimization crimes, we don't tend to think about it being a man, or if it is a man, there's some evidence that they're not believed as much. They're less believable as a male complainant. So, so we did that manipulation, and then we used, your scale, the juror decision scale. And so we could assess not only verdict, so we assessed verdict categorically, guilty, not guilty, and then the 16-item JDS that measures, the certainty principles of Pennington and Hasty's story model. So, complainant believability, defendant believability, and decision confidence. And so we did this. We used a jury eligible population. I used Qualtrics to get the sample, and then they did their thing with that. So I'll get to that. There's obviously some strengths and some pretty clear limitations to the way that we did this. But what we found was that the majority of verdicts were guilty, which that in and of itself I thought was surprising. There was a statistically significant difference in that the male defendant was found guilty more frequently than the female defendant. That's not so surprising. That's certainly a question that we thought would, we thought that's probably how it would play. But there were no differences in when just doing like a t-test of complainant believability, defendant believability, and decision confidence. There weren't significant differences between the female defendant condition and the male defendant condition. So when we did a logistic regression analysis, though, and we included complainant believability, defendant believability, decision confidence, and defendant gender, all of those together, the model definitely, predicted the verdict. But what was interesting when we looked at kind of parsing out each individual variable, defendant gender did not significantly contribute to that. So and as you can imagine, as the complainant believability went up, the more likely, it would be that you would get a guilty verdict. As defendant believability went up, the less likely, to get a guilty verdict. And also then when complainant believability was lower, then people's decision confidence was also lower. So, I mean, that it all makes sense, from a common sense kind of a standpoint, but that's really the evidence really bore that out. So, a lot of questions. I mean, this was just a first pass kind of in this realm. There's a lot of research I think that needs to be done before, I mean, I'm saying these results with a lot of caution because, there was no deliberation component. There was no visual component. We didn't have folks, we didn't have a trial reenactment, whether live or by video. I personally think that's a really important piece, especially getting back to this complainant believability part. If a person doesn't fit the stereotype, what effect might that have? So those are just some of the limitations. And I think future research needs to do that, which I'm currently doing another project right now, actually, and with one of your colleagues, so we have some preliminary evidence from that is kind of interesting.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, there's definitely, like you say, there's study limitations with almost all mock jury research, given the difficulties we have getting access to real jurors, right? But in the absence of other research, I mean, I would caution you not to talk down the findings, and also the importance of the findings, given that there's basically no prior research that you're aware of in this area, particularly in this particular context, whereby we can glean understanding. And I guess more important in the US than even in the UK, given that you are able to ask questions to jurors as part of the selection process, and there are your mock jury research is able to have a greater impact on the real jury trial process than we have in the UK. So I think the findings are definitely important. And like you say, they're the first stage in a series of studies. So I'd be interested to hear about kind of some of your preliminary findings with the new research, and how are you taking this design forward? What are you kind of exploring now?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just say one other thing, kind of looping back to that I think the practical application based on this limited research, but I think also based on what we're finding in this next iteration, is that prosecutors should take these cases to trial. If they have the evidence, that they shouldn't sit on it, they shouldn't settle for a quote unquote lesser crime, because it appears that people are very willing to render a guilty verdict if they think there's evidence of sex trafficking. And that's a whole other question, like is there just a ceiling effect here because of how prevalent sex trafficking has been in the media, which that could just be a bias in and of itself, that a person just goes, oh, sex trafficking, guilty, that they're not even examining the facts. I mean, that's one possible interpretation. It could also be that extra legal factors don't have an effect because the facts of the case are so clear. That's a more charitable view. I'm not sure that's really what is happening, but so in this current iteration, we're doing a cross-cultural view of attitudes towards sex trafficking. So we're using a measure of sex trafficking myths, and we're looking at UK and US folks. And then we also included a scale measuring right-wing authoritarianism. And then we did another experimental simulation similar to the first study. We expanded the mock trial summary, and we had to make the facts so that they would work in with UK law and US law. So you can't brandish a gun in the UK, but the US, I guess everybody has one. So it's a different, that's a different thing. But what we have found so far is that, and again, this is very preliminary, but it doesn't appear that there's any difference. So in this one, we varied the gender of the complainant. So we included a male complainant in this one. And there's actually no difference between the groups. Like, gender of the complainant, gender of the participant, none of that seems to affect the verdict. The vast majority of verdicts were guilty, again, and no difference between UK and US folks. So even though it's not significant, I think it's significant that that's the case. But what is really interesting, and this is the part that is super preliminary, but looking at differences in attitudes between UK and US folks, kind of in, how much do they subscribe to some of the myths? And it appears that US folks are less empathic, but yet weirdly also think that we have more of a responsibility to intervene. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that. But the other thing is that, and this is not so surprising, but that the US folks, the US participants appear to be much higher in right-wing authoritarianism than UK folks. So, again, not surprising. But we did ask about political affiliation as well. And we got a pretty broad spectrum of responses. So we have, I think by the time that we're done, we'll have about 400 participants, roughly 200 in US, 200 UK. So it's a pretty decent sample size. So we'll have a lot more to say after we're gathering a little bit more data. So we'll have more to say after we get this last bit.
Really interesting findings coming out there. Some stuff, I guess, like you say, that we perhaps would predict and expect, and some more surprising stuff. I have to say, again, it's early days, so I won't give too much away, but in the UK, myself and a colleague, Siobhan Ware at Lancaster University, have just done some research looking at the prevalence of rape myth beliefs in relation to males, so male rape myth acceptance scores, male rape myth beliefs, and females. And we are seeing a kind of, there was over 4,000 participants took part in the sample, and it was collected in a kind of nationally representative way. And we're seeing there's definitely a shift in terms of rape myth beliefs, albeit in an abstract way. So applied to a particular case, those beliefs may interact differently, especially among the jury group. But in an abstract way, when we ask broad brush questions about rape myths, there does seem to be a decrease in the endorsement of some of these more problematic views. So it could be, and that was part of the early questions I was asking around, are there high profile cases, or has there been high profile cases locally? that may mean that your participants in your US study, the study you did as part of your doctoral research, and also this new study, that basically means that locally people say, look, we have a problem with this, and that's the sort of people that would be selected onto juries. We have a problem and we have a responsibility based on your current findings that to do something about this, versus, I guess, a more stereotypical rape or sexual assault case where the he said, she said dynamic appears. There's definitely something going on, isn't there, in sex trafficking cases about the power imbalance and who's likely to be an archetypal victim. And I guess an interesting thing to do, and I'm sure you've got plans for this, would be perhaps varying the scenarios and the cases by which the victim, how do they manifest as a victim in the broader sex trafficking? Because we have, I don't know if it's the same in the US, I suspect it probably is, but we have this problem in the UK whereby victims of sex trafficking female victims of sex trafficking may actually become part of the organised crime network in a more senior role and used to recruit other women into those roles. And I guess part of that is, understandably, they're not perhaps exposed to the same level of victimization if they have one of those more senior roles. And so, I think there's lots of different ways and scenarios by which the complainant blame and believability may vary based on different scenarios. But a career's worth of research for you to explore, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a big question too in the legal system, that if somebody was essentially coerced at some point, but then they move into this more, administrative role, can they be tried, for sex trafficking? And in some places they've said no, because they're not entirely culpable if they've been, essentially brainwashed into, or, coerced in some way into taking on that kind of a role.
Yeah, I mean, and we see this in trafficking. So we have a problem in the UK, women that are trafficked across borders into sex trafficking, sex work, often against their will. And those that there's often some sort of debt in order to be paid off. Once arriving here, they come on false pretenses. And then men that are from certain parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, that are forced into running like cannabis farms. And again, they're willingly, actively taking part in that each day in those criminal behaviors and activities. However, they aren't, they've been coerced into it. They've been brought here on false pretenses and for all intents and purposes forced into the role. So it's not sex trafficking, but it's criminality by way of trafficking. And again, sometimes we see those individuals progress into more senior roles in the organised crime network, despite actually being a victim to begin with. And so what is their criminal responsibility? It's a difficult one, isn't it? From a moral point of view versus application of the law as it exists. So in terms of the previous research, because I guess the recent stuff is very preliminary and you're still working on developing this and more data collection, etc. But in terms of the early work you did on this, looking at how jurors' decisions may manifest in these cases, have you had any interaction with policymakers? Do you feel that there's potential for policymakers to take note? I think perhaps in our previous conversations, it seems like you may have in some ways better opportunity in the US for policymakers and practitioners to listen to the findings, but I guess also some different difficulties too.
Yeah, so I think in a previous conversation that we had, we were discussing this, but we have and I think you mentioned the same kind of organization. It's called SARC here. It's Support, Advocacy, Research. Now I'm losing all of the acronym, but it used to be, Sexual Assault Resource Center was what it started off, and they've changed it because they've expanded, the services that they offer. But anyway, they have a sex trafficking, kind of a special sex trafficking victims unit where they provide services to folks that have been trafficked and, help them to get out and provide all of the support that they would need to do that. They also are connected, of course, with our legal system and with the prosecutor's office. And so we've been talking with the SARC organization, and they're very, very keen, to hear more about our research. And then also they're working on getting us an audience with the prosecutor's office here in our area to talk about that. So they seem to think that they will be open to hearing it. Now, how much they buy it, I don't know, but we'll do our best to, to convince them that, if you have the facts, bring it. And, I think the big question, and this is again another area for future inquiry, would be, what do you need to do to make a complainant or a witness, to make them as believable as possible? Because that's really what it hinges on, that the more believable that person is, I think the more that a person could put themselves in that role, like, wow, that could happen to me. I think that's one of the things that is an important step that, needs to happen in the legal system. But I also think it's important for us to just recognize, what it is, that the public needs to understand what it actually is, and to hopefully be able to recognize it when it's happening, whether it's one of my students that I see, and then what can I do? Or, we know in the healthcare system that most people who've been trafficked, they've been seen by a healthcare provider while they've been enslaved, and it hasn't been identified. So, how can we help at that end of it too?
Absolutely. And I think, I completely agree with you on that front. Education is undoubtedly the key. So knowledge and information about what tends to happen, what are the signs to recognize in order to be able to intervene and help immediately, longer term, but also education among jurors, right? So if the general public better understand what goes on in these cases and the process of becoming victimized, the repeat victimization, etc., then, albeit your findings suggest maybe we don't need to necessarily widespread education, because it may not be that much of a difficult ask of jurors, but the better their understanding, of course, the better they're able to make accurate, reliable decisions, fair decisions based on the evidence, rather than some sort of perception of the victims as not being a real victim, or, the stereotypes that surround victims of sexual violence more broadly. Really interesting research. I have to say, there's definitely, and I'm glad to hear that there's this cross-cultural stuff going on now, where you're looking at different contexts and how different the UK versus the US perceive some of these different case types. If you had a magic wand and had all the money and resources in the world, how would you take this research forward even further? So what might you do in terms of saying, okay, this is, get rid of all the restrictions, this is how this study could really inform policy and practice and our understanding of how jurors make decisions in these cases?
Yeah, I think your study provides an incredible model where get actual people from the legal system, get judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and go through, reenact the process where, try out different sets of facts, try out different, essentially see what are the effects of different extra legal factors here. Again, that may not be as necessary if in fact, the public is just willing to go there anyway. But I still just have that, my biggest question is, if somebody actually sees the complainants, will they still, will they do the victim blaming game, or will they actually believe the complainant? So, because it's one thing to read about it, in a mock trial summary, it's an entirely different thing to see somebody. And, what if they are not, what if they're not articulate? Even though they can answer questions, just the way that they answer questions may have an effect. So I would like to, to test that out. Let's see it in a more reenacted, court kind of a situation, how it plays, because it could be very different.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know in the specifics of how it works out there, but would there potentially be opportunity to do stuff in a, if you're working with the prosecutor's office, would there be potential to, I know there's the concept of shadow juries, where you have your participants sit in the real case and therefore you take them away and do some intervention with them, and some ask questions and watch them deliberate, etc. Do you think that could be a possibility in the US system?
It's a really interesting question. I'd never even thought of that, but I think that would be really cool. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. The courts are open to the public. There can be situations where they're not, but I don't really see why the court would care.
Yeah, I think that would be more possible in the US than the UK, just given in terms of how, access to the trial process, and whether, the fact that it's televised, for example, would suggest that there's not highly secretive or confidential aspects, albeit, like you say, in some cases there will be. bits of the court and the case that are closed, but it could be an interesting way to take it further, whereby you have your participants, and in terms of ecological validity, which we're always shooting for in experimental psychology and kind of psycholegal studies, could be an interesting way to go. I'd be really interested to see how that would play out. And then I guess you could deliberate with your jurors, observe deliberations in private, away from having observed the real case, and do some sort of anecdotal comparison to the outcome of the real trial, and try and get some deeper insight into jury decisions and deliberations. But I think you're onto something. I really do. I think you're onto something. I think there's a really interesting body of research to come out of this. And so I really appreciate the work you're doing. And now I'm glad to hear the cross-cultural aspect as well. Means for lots of publications to come, no doubt, lots of writing and submissions ahead of you. But I look forward to reading all this work.
Well, thank you. And it's just been so wonderful to get the opportunity to work with you. So I wouldn't have, had this opportunity had you not published your juror decision scale. That's how I got started in kind of lining this up in the way that I did. So, and I really appreciate your mentoring and support through the process.
Oh, that's great. It's great to connect with you and have this cross-culture. Just before we started recording today, we were talking, weren't we, about differences between systems, and so I think, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So I do appreciate that. I have one thing I'd like to just kind of end on, if that's all right. And I guess that's a broader point in terms of the process of studying and kind of criminal justice studies in the US versus the UK. So could you just give our students a bit of an overview around how it works in the US? So, if somebody potentially wanted to come, having done an undergraduate degree or a master's degree in the UK, if they wanted to come and do their PhD and do, similar sort of study to what you did in your doctoral research, like how does the process work? What sort of timeframes do they have to do, and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so it would depend, of course, on whether a person is interested in doing a more criminal justice kind of a track, or whether they're interested in experimental psych, which is really, most forensic research is kind of under, in the US anyway, it's kind of under the umbrella of social psych. I mean, some places have very specific forensic, programs, but it tends to be, it's like experimental psych is the big umbrella, social psych is under that, and forensic is kind of housed under that. So it would be possible really to do this in any experimental psych, PhD program, as long as there's somebody there who's interested in, doing that kind of research. So the process for most people is that you don't have to have your master's. The master's is granted along the way. Most folks apply to a PhD program with their bachelor's degree, which is their 4-year undergraduate degree, and then they work on the master's. So the master's is usually kind of a preliminary study, or it could be a replication of another study or something like that. And then the PhD dissertation is, more of an expansion of that. But like for me, I mean, I didn't, if I would have started earlier, if I didn't let my credits expire, I wouldn't have had to start over and, retake statistics and all of that again. But if somebody were to have a master's degree and then were to want to enter a PhD program, each program it's going to be on a case-by-case basis how they accept the credits transferring in. If a person is able to demonstrate that they have the skills in, say, statistical analysis, then they might be able to, not do that. But they may not have to, earn an additional master's degree either. So, but each institution is probably going to have somewhat different requirements, like what sort of courses do you need to take? And then, so the process usually is courses, and then some sort of comprehensive exams, qualifying exams, and then the dissertation. I mean, that's the big thing. If it were in a clinical kind of a setting, then like the American Psychological Association accredits clinical programs, and those programs are the same everywhere you go. But experimental programs are much more kind of individualized to each institution. So.
Okay, that's good to know. And in terms of general length, because a PhD in the UK is fair, I mean, doctorates and PhDs vary slightly, but a PhD tends to be around 4 years as a standard. Is that similar sort of time or longer? Yeah, similar time.
It's very similar. Yeah. I mean, if a person were to enter with their bachelor's degree and didn't have a master's, I would say it would be, a 5-year process getting the master's along the way. It wouldn't be a master's degree program. It would be just basically a master's thesis kind of when you're ready to do it. It's not as structured as there are master's programs, like the University of North Dakota, for example, has a master's in forensic science program. They also have a PhD program. And, in that situation, a person could enter with their master's and then they could jump into the PhD. So I can't answer this for sure, but a program like that might be a really good fit for folks from the UK, because that program is already structured, kind of expecting people to be entering the PhD perhaps already with their master's. And so they might have a shorter route. I would guess it would be at least 2 to 3 years beyond master's on average.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you. Yeah, we're not holding to any of that, just a kind of general, because I think we often in the UK don't know much about how it works. But I know for sure that some of the master's students that I work with would probably love to go to the US and do PhD and be able to do some of the research that you're talking about, and the research that you've been involved in, which is really interesting and I think has a big future ahead in terms of possible directions and, like you said, the complainant gender, all sorts of case variation. There's kind of a lifetime of research, isn't there? I guess that's some of the benefit of mock juror research, where we're restricted with doing stuff with real jurors. It means that these experimental manipulations and variations on design give us a whole host of future studies to carry out.
Yeah, that's for sure. And of course, the hope is that it will contribute to making a difference, just like you're saying that you're seeing that perhaps people are subscribing less to rape myths. I mean, that's fantastic. And, of course, it's fun to do these experimental simulations, but I really hope that they'll actually have a practical use too.
Yeah, and I think you're, like you say, further studies to kind of confirm your results, but I think you're onto something, and you have a real opportunity to impact policy and practice in the US in this area, which is clearly a problem and needs some work with criminal justice organisations to make sure that, first of all, and we have this same problem in the UK with rape cases and sex cases more broadly, that the cases get taken to trial so that the jury have an opportunity to render their verdict, rather than just being dropped out of the system before it gets to that stage. Right. And of course, the root of all that is then victims' access to justice, which has got to be a key priority, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Kay Lynn. Excellent to hear about the research you're doing, the future steps and what you found. And I'm going to direct people to your doctoral research and to your recent publication in this area for those that want to kind of read in more detail and depth. But yeah, that's excellent. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I'm very happy if folks want to email me and, talk more about it. I'm very happy to do that.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'll make your contact information available then. And yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Don.